She came crawling out of the Badlands with dust in her mouth, and a baby pressed to her chest like a secret too fragile to speak aloud. The wind had gnawed her cheeks raw. The sun had peeled her lips. Her boots were gone, left in the mud 2 counties back when the river tried to swallow her whole. Now she walked barefoot, skin split and bleeding, every step a silent scream swallowed into the dry belly of the earth. The baby stirred, tiny fists twitching in her arms, the only warmth left in a world turned to ash. Her breath came in shivers, not from cold but hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Drank from a rusted trough. Slept in a hollow beneath a dying tree while coyotes howled lullabies across the canyon. Every time her eyes closed, the past came clawing. Him, the man she ran from, his hands like ropes, his voice like thunder in her skull. But this land didn't care. It didn't ask questions. It just let her walk, as long as she kept walking. And she did. She followed the trail where the wagon wheels had grooved the ground into memory. Past fence posts that leaned like old men and skeletons of barns too tired to stand. The horizon burned gold as evening spilled its color over the hills, and then she saw it. A house. Far off, just beyond the cottonwoods. Low and square, with a red roof and smoke coiling lazy from the chimney. A barn nearby, its door swinging like a heartbeat in the wind. Fence lines crisp and taut. A place lived in but quiet, no dogs barking, no voices carried by breeze. She hesitated, then the baby whimpered. She drew her shawl tighter around them both and limped forward. The porch creaked beneath her weight. Her fingers trembled as she raised them to the door. Once. A knock. Barely a sound. She waited. Behind the door, silence held its breath. She counted the seconds, the way she used to count bruises in the dark. The baby stirred again, tiny mouth rooting against her chest. She blinked through the blur of sun and tears, about to turn away, when the door opened. And there he stood, tall, weathered, one eye shaded by the brim of a hat, the other catching the last of the sun. His jaw was scarred, burned or torn long ago, and his left hand hung strange at his side, fingers curled like they remembered pain. He didn't speak. She could feel him taking her in. The dust, the blood, the baby small and fevered. Her eyes, hollow from too many empty miles. "I can work," she said, voice like cracked leather. "Clean. Cook. I just need somewhere out of the wind." He looked down at her feet, then at the child. A breath passed, then another. He stepped back, opened the door wider. That was all. No questions. No promises. She stepped inside. The air was warm, smoky with wood and iron. A fire breathed in the hearth. The floor was swept, the shelves neat. Simple, worn honest. She lowered herself to the floor without asking and laid the baby down beside her, swaddled tight in the last clean piece of cloth she owned. The man disappeared into another room. When he returned, he had a blanket. He set it down between them, not too close, not too far. She nodded once. He nodded back. That night, she didn't cry. Her tears had dried in some earlier storm. But as the fire cracked and popped, and the baby's chest rose soft and steady against her arm, she allowed herself to breathe like someone who wasn't running. In the morning, he was gone. But on the table, a slice of cornbread waited beside a tin cup filled with well water. A small mercy, silent and sure. She didn't touch the bread, not yet. She tore half for the baby, softening it with water, coaxing her to eat with gentle fingers and softer words. Then she stood. There was a broom by the door, a bucket by the basin. No one told her what to do. No one had to. She cleaned the hearth first, then the floor, then the windows, though the glass was so cloudy it hardly mattered. Her muscles ached, but work kept the ghosts away. It wasn't until the third day she saw him again in full light. He'd returned with feed and salt from town, leading a mule with one good eye and a limp. She was by the garden bed, what was once a garden anyway, now brittle and fallow. He didn't speak, just nodded toward the well. She understood. They moved like two people who'd forgotten how to speak, who trusted silence more than sound. There was no need to explain. The world had explained enough to them already. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the plains, mean and sudden. Thunder cracked the sky wide, and the baby cried out in fright. She froze. Her breath caught. The storm took her back, to fists and slammed doors, to hands yanking her by the hair, to rain pounding on the roof while her world burned below it. She clutched the child close, crouched in the corner by the stove. The man walked in, drenched and still. He didn't come near. just lit the lamp slowly, set it by her side, and left the room. She cried then. Quiet, so the baby wouldn't feel it. But deep. Not from pain, but release. When the storm passed, the baby slept. The fire was still going. The next morning, there was a small toy on the table. A bird carved from pine, its wings unfinished, but its body smooth. She touched it with fingers that shook, then smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the lips but lingers behind the eyes. He was outside, mending fence wire. She stood in the doorway while before stepping down the porch steps. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept tying wire, slow and firm. "Why'd you let us stay?" she asked. He pulled the last twist tight. Looked up. "You knocked." She almost laughed, but she didn't. That night, she swept the front steps clean, lit the lantern herself, fed the baby, then rocked her to sleep beneath the hum of a quiet house. No promises had been made. No lines drawn. She didn't know how long this could last. Maybe days. Maybe longer. But in that space between two damaged hearts, there was no fear. Only a strange, quiet understanding. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt allowed. And sometimes that's where all the healing begins. The days folded into one another like pages worn soft by time. Morning bled into dusk, dusk into night, and she learned the rhythm of the ranch the way a child learns to read, slowly, painfully, one heartbeat at a time. He rose before the sun. She heard the floor groan beneath his boots, the front door creak open, the soft clink of tack in the morning frost. By the time light filtered through the dusty panes, he was already gone, out to tend the land that seemed to resist being tamed, like everything else out here. She cleaned, quietly, methodically. The house was never dirty, but she scrubbed anyway. Floors, shelves, windows so clouded with age they reflected more memory than light. The baby slept longer now, her cheeks rounder, her limbs stronger. She'd coo and gurgle at shadows, waving her tiny fists like they were flags of survival. That child didn't cry like before. She belonged now. Sometimes the man would return just before sundown, mud on his boots, dry blood on his knuckles from mending fence wire or hauling lumber too rough to forgive his skin. He'd nod once. Sometimes he'd hand her a small thing, an extra carrot, a cracked tin of dried berries, once even a scrap of fabric for the baby's blanket. Not a word passed between them unless it was necessary. But in that silence bloomed something, not affection yet. Not trust even, but recognition. Like two scarred animals sniffing the same air and choosing not to bite. One afternoon the baby grew hot, listless, her cries short and sharp. She clutched her to her chest, heart pounding like a war drum. Fever dreams from her past flooded in. She saw graveyards full of infants, mothers weeping into earth that never gave anything back. She stepped out onto the porch, trembling, barefoot again, without thinking. He was at the trough, washing his hands. She couldn't speak, just looked at him, eyes wide and panicked. He didn't ask, didn't flinch. He walked inside, pulled down a jar of dried bark, poured hot water over it, and soaked a rag. Then he knelt beside the baby, his large hands awkward but steady. He pressed the cloth to the child's brow and held it there, unmoving. Not praying, just present. She sat beside him, close enough to feel his heat. The baby cried once more, then went quiet. Together they sat, two strangers bound by one small, fevered life. When the child's breath evened out and her cheeks paled to normal, the woman turned to him, voice nearly gone. "Thank you." He didn't look at her, just stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and said, "She's strong." That night, she didn't sleep on the floor. He pointed to the spare cot against the far wall. Still no words, just a gesture, a glance. She lay there long after the fire burned low, staring up at the ceiling's wooden beams, wondering how long it had been since someone called her child strong and meant it. The next morning, a wooden spoon rested beside her plate. He had carved it, rough, uneven, but shaped with care. She stared at it longer than she should have. It was the kind of kindness that made you ache, not smile. It rained the next day. A cold, mean rain that lashed sideways across the plains. She wrapped the baby tight and set her in the corner near the hearth, then turned her face to the window. The man worked outside in it, as if storms meant nothing to him. When he returned, soaked and silent, she met him at the door with a towel. He hesitated, then took it. That was the first time their hands touched. His skin rough and scarred, hers cracked but warm. That night they ate stew in silence. But the silence felt different now. It didn't feel alone. In the weeks that followed, she began to speak more. Not often, just in pieces. He'd return from the field, and she'd mention the fence hinge needing oil, or that a fox had been near the chicken coop. He never responded with more than a nod or a low grunt, but he listened. That mattered. One morning, he handed her a bag of seeds. She stared at it, uncertain. "For the garden," he said simply. She blinked, then smiled, soft and slow, like the first sunlight after a long storm. The land behind the house was hard and stubborn. She knelt in the dirt anyway, baby asleep in a basket beside her, fingers digging into soil that had known too many droughts. She planted every seed like a promise. He watched from the porch. Didn't offer to help. Didn't need to. That night, as she nursed the child beneath the lamplight, she looked up at him. "I was married once," she said. He didn't speak. Just waited. He said I was pretty when I kept quiet. Said I was lucky he stuck around after the baby. Said no one else would want someone like me. The words came out flat. Not bitter, not sad. Just worn down from use. He was silent for a long time. Then, softly, "They always say that." Her breath caught. He walked to the fire, picked up the iron poker, stirred the coals. The room flickered. "Mine died in a fire," he said. "Wife. Son. Couldn't get to them in time." She didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that kind of loss. Only to feel it with him. The next day, she found a small picture frame on the mantel. Faded, soot-streaked, but inside was a woman with bright eyes and a little boy who looked just like him. She dusted it gently and placed it back with care. They didn't talk about it again. But the air between them shifted. Something had been named. And naming it meant neither of them had to hide any more. Then, one still afternoon, the baby laughed. It was sudden, bursting out of her like music from a cracked bell, wild and clear. She was looking at the man who had bent awkwardly to retrieve a dropped spoon and made a strange face in the process. He froze, caught mid-motion. The baby laughed again. Then again. He looked up at the woman, startled. She smiled through tears. It was the first time he smiled back. Not much, just a twitch of the mouth. But it was enough. From then on, things softened. He came inside more often. Ate beside her instead of across the room. Asked how much milk was left, if the baby had been warm enough at night. He even tried to whittle a second bird toy. It came out lopsided, but the gesture made her heart ache. One evening, she stood at the sink, washing dishes, when she felt him behind her. She didn't turn, but he reached out, gently, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, reverent. She closed her eyes. No words, only warmth. But the warmth didn't last. Because kindness, when it's new, always fears the sound of boots on a distant trail. And one day they came. Late afternoon. Sky smeared with red and gold. A rider approached, dust rising behind him like smoke from a coming fire. She saw him from the kitchen window. Froze. He dismounted, tied his horse, walked toward the porch. She stepped out before the man could. He was young. Too clean. The kind who smiled with teeth and eyes that meant none of it. "Got business," he said, voice slick. She said nothing. He looked her up and down, then past her. "Word is, a woman with a baby's been staying here. Left something behind. Or someone." The rancher appeared behind her. Didn't speak. Just stood there, solid as stone. The rider tilted his head. "Ain't looking for trouble. Just want what's owed. The man back east, he paid for her. Says the child's his." Her breath caught. The rancher stepped forward, slow. "This land's mine," he said. The rider laughed. "I ain't claiming the land, friend." The rancher didn't blink. "She's under my roof. You ride off. Or you stay and don't ride again." Silence. Then the rider smiled again. "We'll be back." He mounted. Rode off. Dust rose, then fell. The woman turned to the rancher, eyes wide, voice thin. "I can't stay. He'll bring more. I won't let them ruin your life, too." The man looked at her, long and hard. His jaw clenched. "Then we fight trouble," he said. "Together." She opened her mouth, closed it. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she reached out, not for survival, not for safety, but for him. Her fingers touched his. He didn't pull away. That night, she didn't sleep with one eye open. That night, she dreamed of a fence with no broken boards, of a door that stayed open, of a garden blooming green in the unforgiving dirt, a future not promised but possible. The sky turned gentler after that day, as if even the weather knew there'd been a shift. Spring came quiet but sure, drawing green through the cracks of the dead earth. The woman rose before dawn now, not to flee, not to hide, but to tend the garden with a quiet fervor. Her fingers dug through the soil like they were searching for something buried deeper than seeds. Each morning, she whispered to the baby who watched from a blanket on the porch, her eyes wide and curious. "This one's corn," she'd say softly. "And this little row, lilies, if the ground forgives us." The man built her a shade frame out of scrap wood, left it leaning by the garden without a word. She found it the next day, anchored it over the baby's basket, and left a wildflower tucked between the boards in thanks. He found it, said nothing. But the next time he brought her something, it was not wood or wire. It was a book, worn, water-stained, the binding frayed. But inside were poems she hadn't read in years. She sat by the window that night, the baby nestled on her lap, and read aloud to the flicker of the oil lamp. Her voice was rusty, but the rhythm came back. Words like music that once belonged to a version of her who wore shoes and believed in tomorrow. She didn't know if the man listened. But the next day, he added 2 shelves to the wall beside her cot. That was how they spoke, through actions, through presence, through absence carefully filled. And then quietly it bloomed. Not a declaration. Not the desperate kind of love that claws and burns. This was something steadier. A kind of knowing. The way he'd glance at her before taking the last piece of bread. How she began leaving water on the table before he came in, already cooled. One morning, the baby took her first steps, 2, then 3, before tumbling into the grass. She let out a shriek of delight, arms flapping like tiny wings. The woman laughed, deep and real, her hands pressed to her mouth. The man stepped forward, stunned. The child reached up, toward him. He froze, one boot half raised. Then, carefully, slowly, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. The baby nestled into his shoulder, small fingers gripping the worn collar of his shirt. The woman said nothing. She didn't need to. That night, he lingered by the fire after supper. She pulled out the book again, opened it to a page she hadn't read yet. Her voice filled the room, soft, low, steady. She felt him listening this time. Felt the heat of his presence like the warmth from the flames. It wasn't perfect. There were days when silence stretched too long, when old fears rose from the floorboards like dust. She still woke some nights with sweat on her neck, the echo of a voice that didn't belong to him in her ears. But he never asked. He never pressed. Only once, she found him sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of pine. "What are you making?" she asked. He looked up. The knife slowed. "Don't know yet," he said, "but the wood'll tell me." She nodded. "I think I'm the same way." He tilted his head. "Was broken for so long. I don't remember what shape I used to be." His eyes held hers. "You ain't broken." There it was again, that gentle refusal to see her as less. It undid something inside her. That night, she touched his shoulder. Just a brush of her fingers, barely there. He turned slightly. She leaned in and pressed her lips to the scar on his jaw. Quiet, reverent. He didn't flinch. Didn't move away. Just breathed. A breath that sounded like surrender. The next morning, the sun came up the color of honey and blood. But the peace didn't last. It never does. The rider returned. He wasn't alone this time. 2 men rode beside him, both younger, rough around the edges, eyes sharp like crows. They didn't ride up to the porch. They stood at the edge of the fence, just outside the garden, where the woman knelt. She stood slowly, shielding the child with her body, heart thundering. The man came out, silent as a shadow. He walked past her to the fence line and stood with arms loose at his sides. Not threatening, but not yielding. The rider smiled, teeth too white for this dusty world. "Told you we'd come back." The man didn't blink. "Still your land?" the rider asked. The man nodded once. The rider tipped his hat. "Well then, we'll do this proper." He pulled out a piece of paper. "Got a claim here. Signed by the judge back east. Says she ran off with his child. He wants the girl returned. You don't. You're harboring a thief." The woman stepped forward, voice tight. "He's lying. He left us with nothing. Never signed her name. Never fed her. He doesn't want her. He wants me to stay afraid." One of the men behind the rider chuckled. The rancher stepped closer to the fence. "No court out here but the land," he said. "And it says she stays." The rider's eyes narrowed. "You gonna draw over a woman?" "I'm gonna stand over what's mine." The rider spat. "This ain't over." He turned, mounted, and rode off, the others close behind. The dust hadn't even settled before the woman spoke. I should go. He turned. She shook her head. He's not bluffing. He'll be back. With more. He'll bring the law, or something uglier. He can't stand that I left him. He wants me back but broken. The rancher's face stayed unreadable. You're not going anywhere. She opened her mouth, then stopped. He took a step toward her. Then another. You think I'd let the rot of some man decide what happens here? I don't fix broken fences just to let wolves through the gate. But I don't want you hurt. I was hurt long before you ever knocked on my door. Silence stretched. The baby babbled beside them, unaware of the storm hanging above. The rancher reached down, picked her up, held her like something fragile and fierce. You stay. You fight. Not just for her, but for you. She looked at him, really looked, and she saw it. Not just a man scarred by fire, but a man rebuilt by it. The heat hadn't destroyed him. It had forged something stronger. She stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest, felt the steady thud of a heart not afraid to shelter others. I'll stay, she said. That night, they packed what they needed. Just in case. He moved the cot into his room. Didn't ask. Just did. She didn't question it. That evening, after the child slept, she lay beside him beneath a worn quilt. Their shoulders touched. Outside, the wind moved the branches like whispers. Inside, they listened to each other breathe. It wasn't the kind of love that flares. It was the kind that burns steady. Quiet. True. But danger hung in the distance like a vulture circling too low. They both felt it. They just didn't know when the storm would break. Only that when it did, they would face it side by side. The wind rose with purpose that morning, not wild or reckless, but steady, like a whisper being carried across the plains, gathering weight. It pulled through the rafters and danced with the curtains, as if the house itself were bracing for something unseen. She felt it in her bones before she opened her eyes. The baby was still sleeping, curled like a comma between them. The man was already up, standing at the window, shirt half-buttoned, his body drawn tight like a bowstring. He wasn't looking at the dawn. He was watching the trail. They're coming, he said softly, as if the words themselves might spook the moment into arriving sooner. She rose, heart slow and heavy in her chest. The fear didn't scream anymore. It hummed low and resigned, like the sound of a church bell at dusk. He had already packed the essentials into a saddlebag. Food, water, a roll of clothes for the baby, another for her. But she made no move to touch them. I won't run, she said, voice plain. He turned to her then, his eyes tired but firm. You won't need to. By noon, the riders appeared. 5 this time. Not 3. Not young boys sent to bluff. These were men who rode with the surety of payment promised and law at their backs. The rider from before led them, his coat cleaner than his soul, papers folded tight in his vest pocket like a weapon. They stopped at the gate. Didn't dismount. The rancher stepped out, rifle slung across his back, hands empty. She followed him, baby bundled in her arms, pressing her heartbeat into the child's through cloth and skin. The rider smiled, all teeth. Well now, he said, ain't this familiar? The rancher said nothing. The man's eyes swept over the woman. Brought the girl, I see. Good. Let's make this clean. No. The word came from her lips. She stepped forward, chin lifted. I'm not property. You don't get to collect me like unpaid debt. The rider's smile twitched, but his eyes sharpened. You stole a child, woman. I birthed her in a barn while you drank whiskey in town. I fed her when you didn't. You'd let her starve. He opened his vest, pulled out a crumpled paper, held it up like a banner. This says otherwise. The rancher moved then. Not fast. Just enough. He took the rifle from his back and planted the butt in the dirt beside him. It wasn't aimed. Not yet. Paper don't mean truth out here, he said, voice quiet. One of the men behind the rider shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. You aiming to fight 5 men, old boy? The rider asked. I'm aiming to keep my home, the rancher replied, and the people I let inside it. The tension cracked through the field like lightning, sharp and metallic. The baby stirred, sensing the storm before it broke. The rider flicked his reins. And then it happened. Quick. 2 of the men dismounted. One drew a pistol. But the rancher was faster. The shot rang out and echoed across the land. Not aimed to kill. Just high. Just enough to shatter the sky and freeze every man where he stood. The rancher didn't flinch. Didn't raise the rifle again. I'll say it once, he said. Next one won't miss. The men hesitated, blinking, hands twitching near holsters. But they didn't move, because sometimes it's not the threat that breaks a man's will. It's the eyes of another who has nothing left to lose. The rider spat in the dirt. She's not worth dying over. The rancher didn't respond. The rider turned his horse. Suit yourself, he muttered. But he won't stop coming. The one who sent us. He always gets what he wants. Not this time, the woman said. He didn't look back. Dust rose behind them, swallowed their shapes. And then it was quiet again. Utterly still. The kind of stillness that only follows thunder. She sank to her knees then, the baby cradled close, and wept, not out of fear, not even out of relief, but because for the first time in her life, someone had stood between her and the storm and hadn't stepped aside. He came to her slowly, kneeling beside her. His hand found hers, rough and warm, grounding her in the dirt. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know, but you won't send me away." He looked at her, really looked, and in his gaze was something deeper than affection. It was belief. "No one else ever knocked," he said. "But you did. That matters." That night, they lit the lamp early. She cooked. He set the table. The baby slept curled in a wooden box he'd lined with flannel and carved stars into. They ate together, like a family. Later, he brought her something. A beam of wood, rough but straight, sanded at the edges. "I thought we might start the porch again," he said. "It's sagging." She took the hammer from his hand and smiled. "I think it's holding just fine." They worked by lamplight, side by side. Each nail driven into the wood was a prayer in its own language. The porch didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to stand. As the moon rose, the baby awoke and toddled toward them on chubby feet, arms outstretched. She knelt, scooped her into her arms, and turned to the man who now stood not beside a house, but a home. "What would you call this place?" she asked. He paused, looked around at the land that had tried so hard to stay empty. Then up at the sky, "Where the wild wind can't reach," he said. She smiled, and in that moment, she wasn't the girl who had bargained her dignity for shelter. She was the woman who had traded fear for roots. Love hadn't saved her, but it had seen her, and that was enough. For now.